you'd like to contact me, send me an email to monty_collier2000@yahoo.com. Welcome to the Presbyterian Research Center. My name is Monty Collier. In this video, I will be discussing R.C. Sproul and Casuistry. This is part 10. In chapter 3 of Chosen by God on page 59, R.C. Sproul decided to teach that men have free wills and the power of self-determination. We've already seen that this contradicts the basic teachings of Scripture. Even so, to buttress this claim, Sproul appeals to Augustine in his 3rd chapter. Now in Casuistry, one often lies by telling half-truths rather than the entire truth. And this is what Sproul has done here. It is true that Augustine taught that men had free wills and the power of self-determination early in his life. But by the end of his life, Augustine retracted many of his prior mistakes, including his view that men had the power of self-determination. Sproul fails to point this critical piece of information out. The latter Augustine taught that men were not self-determined. Near the end of his life, Augustine began teaching that God absolutely predestinated all things. Again, that's a critical piece of information that Sproul chose to leave out. An important point that changes everything. To this day, Papists and Arminians will appeal to Augustine's earlier writings to support their heresy of human free will and synergism. In Casuistry, when one lies by withholding critical information, again, it is called mental reservation. This is why in a court of law in American jurisprudence, we require anybody sworn in to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In his latter book, titled Enchiridion on Faith, Hope, and Love, Augustine writes the following, and I quote, "For what good work can a lost man perform except so far as he has been delivered from perdition? Can they do anything by the free determination of their own will? Again I say, God forbid." End quote. Enchiridion 30, page 36. Here it is clear that Augustine does not believe that unconverted men have the free will power of self-determination. Augustine goes on to write, and I quote, "Nothing therefore happens but by the will of the Omnipotent, he either permitting it to be done or himself doing it." End quote. Abid, this time 95, page 109. From this remark, it may at first glance appear that Augustine is creating a dichotomy between God doing and God permitting. But later remarks seem to suggest that Augustine is coming to understand that because God is omnipotent, God's doing and permitting are the same. For God is never idle. See Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. Discussing permission and God's omnipotent will, Augustine writes the following, and I quote, "For it would not be done did he not permit it. Of course, his permission is not unwilling, but willing. Nor would a good being permit evil to be done, only that in his omnipotence he can turn evil into good." End quote. Page 117 that time. Now this quote from Augustine asserts a rejection of bare permission. The idea that God sits back, is idle, suspends his causation, and allows men to sin by their own free will. Bare permission is asserted by Roman Catholicism, Arminianism, and compatibilism. Bare permission is rejected by Scripture. See Psalm 105 verse 25, Isaiah 45:7, Amos 3:6, Acts 2:23, Romans 9:19, and so on. It's also rejected by Reformed theology. Consider John Calvin's rejection of the pretense of bare permission. Institutes 1:18:1. Having said that, Augustine continues, quote, "The will of the Omnipotent is never defeated. The omnipotent God, then, whether in mercy he pitieth whom he will, or in judgment hardeneth whom he will, is never unjust in what he does, never does anything except of his own free will, and never wills anything that he does not perform." End quote. Page 119 that time. First, notice Augustine contradicts R.C. Sproul's teaching that God is only just in punishing, but not in having mercy and salvation. Augustine clearly teaches that God is just in punishment as well as mercifully remitting sins. See part 2 in this series for the full examination of R.C. Sproul's mistake. We also see Augustine assert in this quote that God alone has free will. That's very important. Now, notice in the above quote, Augustine has said that God does not will anything he does not perform. It's very important. Since Augustine has already stated that God's permission is willing and not unwilling, this implies that God does whatever he permits. Again, God does whatever he permits. So, for example, if God permits evil to be done in a city, God does it. That is, Jehovah causes it to come to pass. This is consistent with the Bible, which states, and I quote, "Shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it?" End quote. Amos chapter 3, verse 6. The quote above is a rhetorical question answered in the affirmative. The more Augustine teaches on God's predestination, the more any alleged dichotomy between God's doing and permitting vanishes. While not as clear as John Calvin, Augustine's teachings, at this latter stage of his life, taken as a whole in the Enchiridion, they are implying that men and angels have never had the free will power of self-determination from God's absolute predestination, before or after the fall. In the Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1559, John Calvin informs us that the attempt to create a dichotomy between God's doing and God's permitting was fabricated by advocates of human free will in opposition to the Bible. Calvin writes the following, pay close attention. He says, and I quote, "A question of greater difficulty arises from other passages where God is said to incline or draw, according to his own pleasure, Satan himself and all the reprobate. For the carnal understanding scarcely comprehends how he, acting by their means, contracts no defilement from their criminality, and even in operations common to himself and them is free from every fault, and yet righteously condemns those whose ministry he uses. Hence was invented the distinction between doing and permitting, because to many persons this has appeared an inexplicable difficulty, that Satan and all the impious are subject to the power and government of God, so that he directs their malice to whatever he pleases, and uses their crimes for the execution of his judgments." End quote. Institutes 1:18:1. The emphasis was mine. In this final quote from Augustine, his Enchiridion, we see Augustine again teach that Adam did not have free will in a metaphysical sense even prior to the fall, and that God willed the fall. He writes the following, quote, "Man, therefore, was thus made upright, that, though unable to remain in his uprightness without divine help, he could of his own mere will depart from it. And whichever of these courses he had chosen, God's will would have been done, either by him or concerning him." End quote. Enchiridion, that was page 125. So we see Augustine has realized that the maintenance of Adam's ethical state at creation, good yet mutable, depends entirely on the will of God, which means Adam's will is not free from God's determination. Remember, this is one of the reasons Martin Luther and John Calvin tell us it is a mistake to use the term free will to describe Adam's ethical state prior to the fall. Men are prone to confuse the metaphysical and ethical categories and assert that Adam had free will from God's absolute predestination prior to the fall. You can see part 8 in this series for the entire discussion. From what we have examined, therefore, it is a mistake to suggest that the latter Augustine held Sproul's view of predestination found in his Chosen by God. Below, in summary, we contrast Sproul's remarks with Augustine's teaching. R.C. Sproul said, quote, "At every point of choice, we are free and self-determined," end quote. Chosen by God, chapter 3, page 59. We now contrast that with Augustine, who said, quote, "For what good can a lost man perform except so far as he has been delivered from perdition? Can they do anything by their free determination of their will? Again I say, God forbid," end quote. Enchiridion 30, page 36. The emphasis was mine. So I hope that helps you guys out as you examine R.C. Sproul's book, Chosen by God, compare it with Scripture alone, do the comparative readings between Sproul and Augustine. God bless.